When historians describe 1816, they focus on what they call the year without summer. Crop failures across Europe, frost in July, snow falling in June across New England, famine spreading through multiple continents. The official explanation remains remarkably simple. The eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia the previous year sent ash into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and triggering global cooling, clean, scientific, contained. But the deeper one examines the atmospheric records, the agricultural collapse patterns, and the curious silences in historical documentation from that period. The more that explanation begins to fracture, because 1816 wasn't just abnormally cold, it was wrong in ways that volcanic ash alone cannot explain. The pattern of destruction was too widespread, the atmospheric phenomena too varied, and the timing, when mapped against the disappearance of Tartaria from global maps, becomes impossible to ignore. Contemporary accounts describe skies that remained dark for weeks, not cloudy. Dark, a persistent dimming that witnesses compared to perpetual twilight. In Switzerland, Mary Shelley spent the summer indoors, unable to enjoy the outdoors, eventually writing Frankenstein during those endless gray days. In New England, farmers reported frosts every single month of the year. In China, summer never arrived. Rice paddies froze. In Europe, food prices tripled within months. But here is what the official narrative omits. The darkness wasn't uniform. Multiple sources describe regional variations that don't match the expected dispersal pattern of volcanic particulates. Some areas experienced blood-red sunsets for months. Others reported a peculiar copper-colored haze that persisted even on days when the sun broke through. Witnesses in different continents independently described the same phenomenon, a quality to the air that felt unnatural, oppressive, wrong. Volcanic eruptions create predictable atmospheric signatures. Ash disperses gradually. Sunlight returns progressively. Climate normalizes within 1 or 2 years. But 1816's effects lingered far longer than Tambora's ash cloud should have allowed. The cooling persisted into 1817. In some regions, normal weather patterns didn't fully return until 1819. 3 years of disrupted climate from a single volcanic event. The science doesn't support it. Unless something else was happening, something the historical record has been carefully edited to obscure. Here is where Tartaria becomes impossible to ignore. By 1820, the name had begun disappearing from European maps with suspicious speed. The vast territory that had appeared on cartographic records for centuries, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, was being systematically relabeled. Russian territory, Chinese territory, Ottoman holdings, undefined regions. The transition happened during the exact years when global climate was collapsing, when skies remained dark, when crops failed across multiple continents, when contemporary accounts describe atmospheric conditions that volcanic ash alone cannot explain. What if the year without summer wasn't caused by Tambora? What if Tambora was simply one visible eruption among multiple catastrophic events? What if 1816 marked the atmospheric signature of something much larger? The final destruction of a civilization that maps were already being redrawn to erase. The official timeline presents Tambora as an isolated natural disaster. April 1815. The volcano erupts. 1816. Global cooling begins, simple cause and effect. But when one examines the full scope of atmospheric disturbances between 1812 and 1820, a different pattern emerges. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow coincides with reports of unusual atmospheric phenomena across Russia. Witnesses describe skies with strange colors. Unusually harsh winter conditions that devastate the French army. Tambora erupts. A real event, certainly. But one event among others. The year without summer. Global climate collapse. Persistent darkness. Agricultural failure. Continued atmospheric disturbance. Climate remains abnormal. Reports of strange aerial phenomena continue across Europe and Asia. Gradual return to normal patterns, but by this point, Tartaria has nearly vanished from maps. The conventional explanation treats each event as unrelated. Random volcanic activity, unusual weather, natural variation. But the clustering is too precise, the atmospheric effects too prolonged, and the correlation with Tartaria's cartographic erasure too exact to dismiss as coincidence. Consider the infrastructure that survived from this period. Massive stone buildings across Central Asia, Russia, and Mongolia. Structures the official history attributes to various empires, to local craftsmen, to gradual development. But these buildings share architectural DNA, the same proportion systems, the same construction techniques, the same evidence of advanced engineering that doesn't match the supposed technological capacity of their attributed builders. What if these structures weren't built by the civilizations we credit them to? What if they were inherited? What if 1816 marked the moment when one civilization ended and another began claiming its remains? The inheritance theory explains too much to ignore. How did post-Napoleonic Europe suddenly acquire the resources and knowledge to build massive neoclassical government buildings across multiple continents? How did Russian expansion into Siberia encounter cities that official records barely acknowledge? How did colonial powers in Asia discover urban infrastructure that shouldn't exist according to accepted timelines? The official answer involves rapid construction, industrial revolution, human ingenuity, but that answer requires ignoring the lack of construction documentation, the absence of labor records, the suspicious uniformity of architectural styles across supposedly unconnected regions. What if they didn't build these structures? What if they found them? What if 1816's atmospheric catastrophe left behind empty cities, abandoned infrastructure, and populations either destroyed or scattered beyond historical record? The pattern of silence surrounding 1816 extends beyond meteorological records. Hospital documentation from this period shows curious gaps. Census data becomes inconsistent. Whole years where certain types of records simply don't exist. Not destroyed in fires or wars, just missing. In France, population records from 1816 to 1818 are notably incomplete. In Germany, several principalities lack coherent documentation for these exact years. In Russia, administrative records show unexplained disruptions in reporting from Siberian territories. The gaps appear too consistent across too many regions to be simple record-keeping failures. And then there are the mass graves. Throughout Europe and parts of Asia, burial sites from 1816 to 1817 contain far more remains than official death tolls acknowledge. The graves are attributed to famine, to disease, to the hardships of the year without summer. But the scale suggests something beyond crop failure. The numbers imply catastrophe on a level that official histories have systematically downplayed. Here's what makes the nuclear winter comparison so disturbing. The atmospheric effects of 1816 match almost perfectly with modern models of nuclear winter. Prolonged darkness, persistent particulate matter in the upper atmosphere, regional variations in atmospheric density, temperature drops that persist far longer than volcanic events typically cause. Blood, red skies, copper-colored atmospheric haze. These aren't volcanic signatures. These are the atmospheric effects of massive combustion events, multiple combustion events, the kind that would result from widespread destruction of cities, of infrastructure, of civilization itself. What technology could create such effects in 1816? The official answer is none. Humanity possessed no weapons capable of such destruction. Therefore, it must have been volcanic. The logic is circular. Because we believe no such technology existed, any evidence suggesting otherwise must be reinterpreted to fit acceptable explanations. But what if the technology did exist? What if Tartarian civilization possessed capabilities we've been taught to believe impossible? The architecture suggests as much. Buildings designed with harmonic principles. structures incorporating atmospheric electricity, construction techniques that modern engineers struggle to replicate with contemporary tools. If Tartaria had advanced technology, if that civilization ended catastrophically, then 1816's atmospheric effects become evidence. Not of volcanic eruption, but of civilizational collapse on a scale we're not supposed to imagine was possible. The eyewitness accounts from 1816 describe more than just cold and darkness. Multiple sources mention sounds, deep rumbling that continued for weeks. Not localized to Tambora's eruption site. Global reports of atmospheric disturbances that don't match volcanic patterns. Witnesses in Europe, Asia, and the Americas independently describing the same phenomena. In New England, farmers reported hearing distant thunder with no storms. In Russia, travelers described low-frequency sounds that seemed to come from the earth itself. In China, records mention aerial disturbances that frightened populations. These accounts appear in different languages in different regions describing the same thing, something happening in the atmosphere, something worldwide. Volcanic eruptions create distinctive seismic signatures. The sounds travel through rock, through water, through air in predictable patterns. But the sounds of 1816 don't match those patterns. They suggest something else, multiple events, coordinated destruction, or the atmospheric echoes of technology we're not supposed to believe existed. The agricultural collapse of 1816 followed patterns that don't entirely match simple climate disruption. Certain crops failed completely while others survived in ways that puzzle agricultural historians. The distribution of famine doesn't correlate perfectly with temperature drops. Some regions with severe cold maintained harvests. Others with milder conditions experienced total crop failure. The pattern suggests something beyond climate. Perhaps soil contamination. Perhaps atmospheric composition changes that affected plant growth in ways pure temperature variation cannot explain. The kind of environmental damage that would result from widespread combustion, from chemical contamination, from atmospheric poisoning on a massive scale. The livestock deaths present another anomaly. Across Europe and North America, farmers reported animals dying in ways that didn't match simple cold exposure. The deaths clustered in specific areas with patterns that didn't follow temperature zones. Modern ice core analysis reveals unusual chemical signatures beyond Tambora's sulfur. Other compounds, trace elements suggesting widespread combustion events from multiple source points. What burned in 1816? And why do the chemical traces appear globally in patterns, suggesting coordinated catastrophe, rather than a single eruption? The architectural evidence becomes even more compelling when examined alongside the climate data. Buildings across Russia, Central Asia, and parts of Europe show damage consistent with rapid abandonment during this exact period. Not gradual decline, not slow deterioration, sudden vacancy. In St. Petersburg, administrative buildings from the pre-1816 era show evidence of hasty departure. Personal effects left behind, documents abandoned mid-filing. The official explanation attributes this to administrative reorganization, to routine government shuffling. But the scale and timing suggest something else: mass evacuation, or mass death. Similar patterns appear in cities across the former Tartarian territories. Buildings that show signs of sophisticated use suddenly becoming empty between 1815 and 1818. The occupants vanished, the structures remained, and within a generation, new populations moved in, claimed them as their own construction, and rewrote the architectural history. The library burnings between 1814 and 1822 show suspicious patterns. The Library of Moscow, the Imperial Archives in St. Petersburg, multiple monastic libraries across Europe. Contemporary librarians noted these fires often targeted specific sections. Maps disappeared disproportionately. Geographic records suffered more damage than other materials in the same facilities. Selective destruction, as if someone was systematically removing cartographic evidence. The linguistic extinctions tell a similar story. Between 1810 and 1830, numerous regional languages reportedly went extinct across Central Asia and Siberia. Languages don't vanish in a single generation, unless their speaker populations are destroyed catastrophically. The speed suggests population collapse on a scale official histories don't acknowledge. And then there is the silence about Siberia. Russian expansion into Siberian territories accelerated dramatically in the decades following 1816. The official narrative presents this as natural imperial growth. But contemporary accounts describe encountering cities, not villages. Urban centers with stone buildings, with infrastructure, with populations that don't appear in any historical record. Where did those cities come from? Who built them? And why does official Russian history barely acknowledge their existence? Unless they were Tartarian cities. Unless 1816 marked the moment when those cities became available for occupation. Unless the catastrophe that darkened global skies also emptied vast urban centers across Central Asia. The inheritance model explains the architectural uniformity. It explains the suspicious lack of construction documentation. It explains how colonial powers suddenly possessed infrastructure they couldn't have built themselves. They didn't build it. They found it. They occupied it. They claimed it. And they rewrote the maps to suggest it had always been theirs. By 1820, the cartographic revision was nearly complete. Tartaria had been erased. The territories relabeled. The cities reattributed. The architectural inheritance explained away as rapid construction during the Industrial Revolution. And the year without summer, just a volcanic eruption. Nothing more, move along. But the evidence persists. The atmospheric records that don't quite match volcanic patterns. The mass graves that exceed official death counts. The architectural uniformity that requires coordinated knowledge. The missing documentation from precisely the years when everything changed. The sounds, the colors, the persistent darkness, the nuclear winter that wasn't supposed to be possible in 1816. What happened in 1816 wasn't just a cold summer. It was a reset. A moment when one world ended and another began. When the skies darkened not from a single volcano but from the atmospheric signature of civilizational collapse. When Tartaria, whatever it actually was, ceased to exist as a political entity and became instead a geographic term to be gradually erased from collective memory. The buildings remember even if the maps have been redrawn. The atmospheric records preserve what the official histories omit, and the persistent questions, the ones that conventional explanations can never quite answer. Those questions remain, waiting for someone willing to look past the volcanic narrative and ask what really happened when the world went dark. The financial records from 1815 to 1820 reveal systematic obscuration. Banking houses experienced unusual wealth transfers without clear documentation. The Rothschild Empire expanded dramatically, acquiring assets across Eastern Europe and Russian markets at suspicious speed. British and French investors suddenly financing projects in territories where they'd had no previous presence. What if these weren't new investments but inheritance claims? What if the financial elite weren't building empires, but occupying economic infrastructure left vacant by catastrophe? The academic suppression followed predictable patterns. By 1850, scholarly consensus was complete. Tartaria had never been real. The year without summer was purely volcanic. Any evidence complicating this narrative was dismissed or ignored. The gatekeeping wasn't censorship. It was institutional management of acceptable questions. Every anomaly had an explanation. Every question had an answer, and anyone suggesting the answers didn't fit was excluded from serious discourse. The consensus held not because evidence supported it, but because institutions required it. The technological implications remain most disturbing. If Tartarian civilization possessed capabilities creating nuclear winter, like effects, either through weapons or catastrophic energy system failures, then technological progress isn't linear. Civilizations can possess knowledge that later societies lose entirely. Pre-1816 buildings demonstrate engineering sophistication official timelines can't explain. Acoustic properties suggesting harmonic resonance understanding. Electrical systems built into structures. Construction techniques modern engineers struggle to replicate. These weren't primitive people gradually developing technology. These were inheritors of knowledge systems lost in 1816's catastrophe, or deliberately suppressed afterward. What medical knowledge, energy systems, organizational principles vanished with Tartaria? The reset wasn't just political or demographic. It was epistemological, a complete civilizational break that inheritors papered over with constructed histories. And the most troubling question, if it happened once, could it happen again? If a civilization that sophisticated could be erased so completely that within 2 generations its existence was debated rather than documented. What prevents the same erasure today? The year without summer was a warning. A glimpse of how completely history rewrites when those controlling the narrative have institutional power and time for memory to fade into disputed legend. The evidence remains, scattered across archives, preserved in ice cores, built into architecture, coded into demographic data. It waits for those willing to ask questions that academic gatekeepers would prefer remain unasked. Questions about what really darkened the skies in 1816. Questions about who benefited from the disaster. Questions about what we lost when Tartaria vanished and what we're still losing by pretending it never existed at all. What technology did Tartaria possess? What knowledge was lost when those cities emptied? And who benefited from rewriting the disaster as natural catastrophe rather than acknowledging it as evidence of capabilities humanity supposedly didn't have in 1816? The year without summer wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new story. The story we're still being told. The one that requires us to forget what the skies looked like when a civilization ended and pretend it was all just ash from a volcano in Indonesia. But once you see the pattern, once you trace the atmospheric data against the cartographic erasure, once you examine the architectural inheritance and the missing records and the mass graves and the sounds in the sky, you can't unsee it. 1816 was Tartaria's nuclear winter, and everything that came after was the inheritance, the cover-up and the silence.